You'll lose over twice as much fat eating minimally processed foods compared to ultra-processed foods, at least according to the press coverage surrounding this study that came out earlier this year. Welcome back to Body Beyond the Scales, a podcast that helps you get stronger and more confident in your body through building better habits. Let's get into it. There's a lot of debate around ultra-processed foods versus minimally processed foods, and this study, which I've looked into, which is by, I've just lost the name of all the authors, which is by some authors that came out this year. And basically it was looking at the ultra-processed foods and minimally processed foods eaten in accordance to the Eatwell guidelines, and it looked into how basically is it one better for the general health and weight loss and overall basically everything. I looked at how people get on eating the guidelines if they eat purely ultra processed food versus purely minimally processed foods. So it looked into how people get on with both, and this is really interesting. This is an area that's currently being studied quite and still a lot of new information coming out about it. And some people will say that the foods that you eat, it doesn't matter as long as you're in a calorie deficit, you'll lose weight. And others argue that diet quality will affect weight loss and overall health. And I think both are true to an extent. And I'm going to be kind of detailing in this study of how ultra processed food might do that, how obesogenic environments can influence that, and the role of food manufacturing in another episode. I'll be going into those. If you would like more details in those, just let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. But in this episode, I wanted to dive into what this paper said, the surrounding conversations around minimally processed foods and ultra processed foods, and we're gonna absolutely get into it. So I want to highlight that this study, the way that it was conducted, it was not a weight loss trial. They did not necessarily do it in order for people to lose weight. However, that being said, they made sure that their participants, they tracked their weight and they commented on the effects of that. The one thing that they acknowledged in this is that they wanted to see how much of a certain food people consume. So basically what they did is they gave the participants the food and said you eat as much or as little of it as you like. And the focus of the trial was to see basically on how much people overate or ate with the variations of the diets, which therefore meant that they didn't control for calories. So ultimately what's most important is in order to lose weight, you need to be in a calorie deficit. That isn't disputed here. That isn't something that they're saying that doesn't count. It definitely does. In order to lose weight, you need to be in a calorie deficit. Energy in needs to be lower than energy out, and that will lead to weight loss. So it's really important to recognize that both sets of people doing the trials ended up in a calorie deficit, and both sets ended up losing weight. It's just that the ultra processed food group ended up losing more weight. Now, this happened because they ate in a bigger calorie deficit. It wasn't anything magical. It was because they ended up in a bigger calorie deficit. Now, one thing that led to was basically the first problem that I kind of found with this paper was that a lot of the headlines and coverage suggested that it was the ultra processed food that was the reason that they didn't lose as much weight. And I would argue differently, because I would say that actually it was the smaller calorie deficit that meant that they didn't lose weight. So the group that ate the ultra processed food, they ended up eating more of it, which meant therefore that the gap between their energy in versus energy out was smaller. So therefore they lost less weight, which makes sense. And that agrees with all the evidence that we also have at the moment. So I want you to take away from this that no matter whether you eat ultra processed foods or you eat minimally processed foods or a combination of both, calories in versus calories out is still the most important thing for losing weight. That doesn't change. That has not changed. However, my hypothesis is that if you matched what's important to say here is that they didn't match calories. And as I said, that makes a big difference, because if we were matching for calories, we probably wouldn't see crazy amounts of difference. However, my hypothesis is if we did match for calories, so say you ate 2,000 calories of ultra processed food and you ate 2,000 calories of minimally processed food, you would still lose more weight on the minimally processed food. And the reason for this is because of something called the thermic effect of food. So the thermic effect of food is just how many calories your body burns whilst you are digesting food. And the highest thermic effect of food is for protein. So foods that are high in protein, you will burn 20 to 30 calories per 100 calories to break that down. And for foods that are so basically fat is the lowest thermic effect of food, which you burn around 0 to 3 calories for every 100 calories that you consume. So if you consumed a diet mainly made of protein, you will basically burn more calories than if you consumed a diet mainly made of fat. And that would therefore affect the energy balance. Now, again, still coming down to energy balance, balance. It's still coming down to energy in versus energy out. But that would influence how much energy is going out because we'd be burning more calories in the consumption of that food. So that's something that I'd really like to recognize here, is that, and that is my hypothesis. That's not that wasn't studied in this study, but I would say that if we did match for calories, we would still see a slightly greater weight loss in the minimally processed food group because of that, because of the thermic effect of food. It's also important to note that some other things can't be broken down, like fibre. So when you eat fibre, you've got soluble fibre and insoluble fibre. Some of it becomes basically pulls water into your gut and feeds the gut bacteria, and some of it forms the bulk of your stool, basically. So basically what goes into your system comes out the other end. So you might have eaten, say, an apple, but the fibre in the apple you're not digesting per se, so you're not necessarily getting the calories out of that the same way that you would do if you ate a bar of chocolate. So it's really important to recognise that the food that you are eating will influence what happens inside your body as well. And that is really important in these studies because, actually, one thing that's important to say here is the study did match for proteins, carbs, fats, and fibre. So the minimally processed food group and the ultra-processed food group had the same amount of fibre, but that was just to make sure that it hit the Eatwell guidelines, which are the guidelines that are set by the UK government for how we should be eating food, or like what our food consumption should look like. So again, it's key to mention that that's not something that's like like the thermic effect of food hypothetically should have been matched in these situations. But it's really, again, important to recognise here that ultra-processed foods tend to be softer, easier to consume, and have been processed, meaning that they're easier to break down, so the thermic effect of food is still going to be lower. So it's really key to say that although it might have had, say, like 20 grams of protein, and that protein might be slightly more easily digestible, and therefore it is easier to it's basically easy to break down, which means that you burn fewer calories from it. Now, this might sound like I'm getting picky around these calories, but I think it's really important in these studies when we get these big headlines that are saying this is going to help you lose weight like better, is to understand why, and why this is happening. And the thermic effect of food is one of those key reasons as to why you would be losing more weight on a minimally processed diet. So yeah, if we're talking about day-to-day people where we're eating a balance between ultra-processed foods and minimally processed foods, we might be eating 80% minimally processed and 20% you're getting from those others, or even 70-30. That's not going to affect you. The difference between the minimally processed foods and the ultra-processed foods is going to be so small, in terms of the thermic effect of food. It's not really affecting you that much on a day-to-day basis. You're not going to be it's not going to be the be-all and end-all of your diet. But I want you to take on with this, just understanding that if you did eat a diet that was mainly made up of ultra-processed foods, you would be losing out on some of that thermic effect of food. And that is key. I want you to remember that, because when it comes to diet quality, thermic effect of food is going to play a part in it. And if we're thinking, okay, well, we're not sure what's going on with calories, I'd suggest that would be a really easy place to start. And plus, you're going to add a lot more nutrients into your life from eating more minimally processed foods. So again, I just want to highlight that this has not been studied in this trial. This is just my take in it. And if we wanted to explore it more, that could have been studied in this trial, is looking at the thermic effect of food that these ultra-processed foods would have. Now, one thing that I absolutely loved about this trial is that they tested the same group of people on both diets and did a washout period. So effectively what they did was they took group number one and made them do the ultra-processed diet, and group number two, they at the same time was doing the minimally processed diet. So they did that for 8 weeks. Then what they did is they had a 2-week washout period where they basically just did something else, and then they swapped over. So group two then did the ultra-processed diet, and then group one then did the minimally processed diet. So whichever way around I said that, they swapped over basically. So everybody in the trial did both protocols. It wasn't as if one group did one and then the other group didn't. This is really cool because it takes into account things like genetics, individual circumstances, bodies, and it controls for these factors in a way that we wouldn't have otherwise have controlled for. So I think that was a really cool way to do it, to test out both groups. Now, is it perfect? No, there's always going to be issues with trials because we're studying humans, we're studying nutrition. This is a tricky thing to do. However, I think this is a super interesting way that they have done it. Now, one thing that I did find interesting for the minimally processed diet was that it actually had a higher dropout rate and a slightly lower adherence rate compared to the ultra-processed food. And I potentially think this is because people found it trickier to stick to the minimally processed diet, because it doesn't allow for life as much. Like, it's really hard to stick to a minimally processed diet and like go out for a meal. Now, these participants would have been eating these meals anyway, but like it's a lot less, I guess it's a lot harder to say, yes, I will stick to this protocol in the event of in the event of it being someone's birthday. Like, you're going to want to go for those more ultra processed foods. That being said, for the study, the adherence rates were really high. I think for both groups they were like 90 something %, which is super high for a study, so that's great. And like, it was there. But I do want to note that like from a behavioral standpoint, it is probably harder to stick to a minimally processed diet all of the time than what it would be to stick to an ultra processed diet all of the time. And part of that comes down to those obesogenic environments that I mentioned earlier. And again, if you want me to cover a podcast on that, I absolutely will do. Just let me know in the comments. But yeah, so now there was one claim that came out of this paper, and it said that if this study had have gone on for a year, the ultra processed group would have had a 4 to 5% weight decrease from their original weight, but the minimally processed group would have had a 9 to 13% weight decrease because of their weight. Now, obviously, those numbers are quite different. So like 4 to 5% versus 9 to 13%, like that is a big difference if we ate just minimally processed food. Now, I would again like to highlight that in theory, this is quite a good statement. You'd be like, yeah, cool, like this is great. However, I would argue that the practicalities of this aren't necessarily there. It is very hard for you to stick to a minimally processed diet for a year straight, again, because of the environment. And the modern world just doesn't necessarily allow for that because of meals out, chocolate aisles, birthday cakes. And chances are you're eating these foods already in your day-to-day life, these more ultra-processed foods. And it would be a huge time demand, lifestyle change. And I just don't buy that people could stick to it for a whole year. Like, on a practical level, I don't buy that people necessarily, especially if you'd been eating, as these participants were at the start, but they'd been eating around a 67% diet that was made up of ultra processed foods. That would be a huge switch because it would be a lot more cooking from scratch. That's a lot more time demanding. That's a lot more resource intensive. It's a lot more, you require more knowledge. And in this study, they physically gave them the food. So it was a lot easier for them to stick to the diet because the food was literally given to them. Like, it was given to them and said, here, eat this. So like, that was a lot easier for them to stick to. So I think this is one of those things where like the science is telling us in this study, this is how it came out. However, in practicality, we need to recognize that life is a little bit more nuanced than that. And like, there's a little bit more detail in the stuff that we do. So yeah, it's really, really important to remember these things when we're talking about studies, because the science can tell us one thing, but like, are they the conditions in which people are living? And how can we take that and make that practical and applicable? Am I saying that word right? In our own lives, is really key. And that's something that like I want you to think about, is saying like, whenever you hear these claims like new study says this, like I want you to think, okay, well, what does that mean for me? Like, how can I implement these things in my life? Because it needs to, whenever you make any changes, they need to be a behavioral change, and it needs to be something that you can integrate into your life. So one thing that I found really interesting was that the minimally processed group reported feeling more satisfied and stopped eating after fewer calories than the ultra processed group. Now, this is how they created a bigger calorie deficit because, well, they ate fewer calories. And whilst they did say that the taste and flavour of the ultra-processed food was better, participants did report feeling more satiated after the minimally processed food versus the ultra-processed food. And they also said they experienced fewer cravings, which is really interesting. So when you're well, first off, this surprised me because when you eat protein and fibre, and these were matched in both of these studies, those two are incredibly satiating things. So if we eat the same amount of protein and the same amount of fibre in both diets, this would basically mean that you're like, in terms of the quality of the food that you're putting in your body, like in terms of the macronutrient quality, they're the same. So hypothetically, satiation should have been the same, but it was higher in the minimally processed group. Now, my theory behind this, and again, this is a theory, but we're going to take practical applications from this, is that it probably came down to a prolonged eating period because minimally processed foods tend to be like they tend to be harder to eat, like there's more chewing involved, so it extends the amount of time that you spend eating, and therefore more chews is effectively needed, which therefore means that you would have been eating for a longer period of time. The other thing as well is that there would have been fewer calories per bite. So minimally processed food tends to be less calorie dense, which therefore means that when you're eating it, you are eating fewer calories per bite, which would mean, again, you would have to have consumed more of the food, meaning that you are fuller. Physically, you would be getting that sensation of fullness in your stomach. You would be feeling fuller, and therefore you would stop eating sooner, which therefore means you've eaten fewer calories. And again, this is just all contributing to that. Now, this is really interesting in terms of like how we can practically apply this. If you are someone that struggles with like you can't just eat a small amount of food, like you could eat a chocolate bar and like yes, you've just consumed say 500 calories, but like you're not full from it, like, and that is most people. That's where knowing about food volume and like volumetrics is really important. So having more of these minimally processed foods in your life will prolong the eating period, which will allow for your brain and your stomach to have that conversation faster, and or rather more effectively because you've got more time. And two, it will also allow for you to eat more food on lower calories. So this is what's really key, and this is something I would advise to most people who are trying to lose weight, is to eat high volume, low calorie foods, which tend to be minimally processed to really help bulk out how much you are eating. And as I've said, this is really useful if you are someone who is overeating. So getting in the sources of protein and fibre from minimally processed foods will make a bigger difference compared to those ultra processed foods. Now, I'd just like to highlight this in practical terms. So what this could look like is eating a chicken breast let's say you get 20 grams of protein from the chicken breast, or you've got a protein shake, which is more processed, it's thinner, it's a liquid, and that's got 20 grams of protein in. It would take more calories and it takes more energy and more time to eat the chicken breast compared to the protein shake, which would be a lot more easily digestible because it's in liquid. It would be there's less chew in there. You can consume it in seconds versus however long it would take you to eat the chicken breast. So it's really important to remember. And the chicken also involves an eating experience, like you are going to sit and chew and your brain recognizes what's going on, compared to you literally just gargle, job done, protein shake, consume. So here, like, if that's kind of what it would look like in practical terms. Now, that doesn't mean stop eating protein shakes because they're like an ultra processed food. I guess technically for some people they do fall under the ultra processed category, which is, yeah, I'll come on to that in a second. But it's really important to look at and go, okay, well, we've got plenty of protein here, and it's a really cost-effective way to get protein in from a protein shake, and it's a really useful way to get in protein like in a time-effective way as well, but they just might not be as satiating compared to if you'd have eaten that from chicken breast. But I think if it's the difference between having hitting your protein goals and not hitting your protein goals, have the damn protein shake, like make your life easy for yourself. Like it's one of those things where it's an optimal versus practical. In an optimal case, yes, you would have eaten it from food, but practically not everybody's going to be able to do that. I will still be having my daily like protein powder / shake in some form. So like don't feel like that's a reason not to eat those things. Another thing to maybe note from this is, and this is again more from me than the study, is that chewing your food more and eating slower just reduces your chances of overeating as well. So like if you want to do those things, like that will massively help with stopping yourself from overeating. So now my other take on this, on the study, was that nobody really eats a diet that's made up of like completely ultra processed foods versus like completely minimally processed foods. So the participants on the diet, they started off, and I've got the number here, it was 67.4% of their intake was from ultra processed foods. So even though they were eating a high amount of ultra processed foods to start off with, it still wasn't 100%. And like it's rare that the conditions of the study would have been the same as real life. Now, from my understanding, this diet was effectively 80% ultra processed foods on the ultra processed food diet, and 20% would have been coming from those minimally processed foods to make sure that you hit your fibre, or rather some foods that like would be more in a bit more of a grey area of how you would consider them. So they got foods which were like whole grains, plain yogurt, oils, cheeses, and they threw them in as part of the minimally processed foods group. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear ultra processed foods, the first thing that I think of is cakes, biscuits, sweets, chocolate. Like it kind of falls under the term that you would otherwise have considered like quote unquote junk food, or like quote unquote bad foods, but like these foods that are less nutritionally dense. When I'm talking to someone about whole grain bread, plain yogurt, oils and cheeses, I'm not worrying too much and thinking, oh yes, well they've been through a food process, because we ultimately know that the food processing is not necessarily the issue in most cases. Food being made and processed is just part of the way that we consume food, like that, and that's okay. Like bread gets made, bread is not a bad thing. Like bread is not negative. So it's really important to see these things and going, okay, well, where's the, I mean, and this kind of comes down to my next critique of ultra processed foods in general, is that like you don't really have a good definition. So they use the standardized criteria called the NOVA criteria. But I still think that like we've got this like colloquial idea of what ultra processed foods are, but like not a categorical definition. And like I think that's part of the problem here, that even the categorical definition, it kind of gave a bit of a like, it was a bit rubbish in terms of like what it's considering as a ultra processed food. Like again, plain yogurt, like who's eating plain yogurt and thinking they're having a good time? Like not me. Like so it's I think really we want some clarity on what this ultra processed food means in that practical sense. And I guess for science and for like practical senses, it's really important that we understand the difference between these things. Like in terms of like the practical habits that you have, you can take from the science and take your understanding from it, but like you don't necessarily have to do them exactly the same way that like a study would do them. Or like, yeah, understanding that you need to eat most of your food from like minimally processed food sources is absolutely fine, but like not sweating over like whether you do eat something ultra processed or not is key. So yeah. So kind of like breaking all of that down then, what is the final verdict on this? So I do think it's a bit of a bold claim to say that you lose twice as much weight on the ultra processed diet compared to the minimally processed diet, because on the minimally processed diet compared to the ultra processed diet, because that you don't defy physics there. Like it was just that they ate fewer calories. So like I don't think that's as sexy as a headline, and the bold claim around it is technically telling us what we think it's trying to tell us. Like it's kind of implying something that's not quite true. So I do think that we need to acknowledge that the group that lost the most weight ate the fewest calories. Like that didn't change, it was still calories. But I do think that in terms of the role of this paper, what it was looking to do was to inform the Eatwell guidelines, which, as I mentioned, are the guidelines in the UK to around how to eat. Now, it is useful to inform food policy, and making recommendations to reduce the amount of ultra processed food that people consume, I don't think it's a crazy bad idea, especially when we know that 3 billion people worldwide are living with obesity and 2/3 of adults in the UK are overweight or obese. So like I think that's is an important thing to say. But like when we talk about food policy, less than 0.1% of adults are currently completely following the Eatwell guidelines, and nearly 70% of adults follow less than half the Eatwell guidelines. So like I'm just not holding my breath that telling people not to eat as much ultra processed food is going to be the big change that like is needed to help reduce those obesity numbers. Like, yeah, that's just my 2 pence. And I guess coming back to you on this, because like that's for me the most important part of this episode, is the practical takeaways that you can get. Prioritizing minimally processed foods as much as possible is key, but I wouldn't lose any sleep over eating ultra processed foods. Like it's okay if you eat ultra processed foods, like the world will still turn. And I consider ultra processed foods to be, and whether this is the definition that you want to go by or not is a different question, but like I consider ultra processed foods to be those foods that don't add nutritional value to your life. So they might be super tasty, they might be they might be, you know, exactly what you think of when you think of like as I guess junk food, because quote unquote junk food, but like they tend to not add nutritional value to your life, or not add much nutritional value to your life, have possibly been mass produced. But I don't want you to like stick on that, because you can mass produce apples in the sense of like a orchard is mass production of apples, and they usually have a very long expiry date. But again, those like kind of last 2 points are more, well, actually all 3 of those points are like arbitrary. So like that's just kind of like how I would roughly get an idea of what that meant if I had to define it. But I still think the boundaries around how we describe like ultra processed food are still so murky that like it's not super clear what like that falls under, and like if you said to people eat a minimally processed diet, like they wouldn't know that like what that meant. So like for you on a practical basis, I want you to just focus on getting more foods that are adding things nutritionally to your life. So thinking about getting in things like getting in more protein, getting in more fibre, but particularly in those from things like plants. So yeah, like just think about those things, and considering swapping to more minimally processed foods if possible. But again, like if that doesn't fit your current eating situation or like your current like living ability, eating minimally processed foods usually is slightly more expensive. So like that is something that's important to mention there. Like if you are cooking everything from scratch, like it's not only expensive like in money, but it can be more expensive in time as well. So just knowing those things is key. Now, I will say that in the UK, the price of fruit and vegetables is okay. It's definitely not as bad as what it is across the world. Like, it's not, by no means am I saying that this is like a cheap experience. However, I will say that like a punnet of grapes versus a bar of chocolate, they are pretty comparable in price. So it's key to like kind of like say, we're not necessarily as bothered by the price side of things in the UK compared to like other countries. Like the US is very bad for like food poverty, basically. It is very expensive to eat minimally processed foods in the US. So yeah, like recognizing that as well. And to be honest, like on a government-wide level, one thing that I would be interested in seeing is better access to fruit and vegetables, making fruit and veg cheaper, more easily accessible, yeah, for everybody. And then I also want you to think about what's optimal versus practical. So if you've had a busy day at work, you have zero ability to cook tonight, and it's the difference between you having a ready meal from the freezer and a takeaway. Take the ready meal. The ready meal is going to have fewer calories in it, and that's going to mean it's probably going to have slightly more fibre in it as well. It's just going to be better for you all round, and it's going to be cheaper than getting the takeaway. And that means, yes, that is not practical, because yes, in a perfect world, you would have cooked a meal from scratch. But like, if you didn't have that time, and that was what was practical, that's the next best thing. Like, that's exactly what you needed to do. So yeah, and I think it's really important to remember that like ultra processed foods aren't the devil. Like they're just not adding anything nutritionally to your life, and they increase your risk of overeating on them. But yeah, that is kind of like my verdict on this whole episode, on this whole paper. And I think a lot of the claims that have been made around it, as in like it's great for like weight loss, you will just reduce your risk of overeating more than anything. But to be honest, eating a higher amount of protein and fibre in general will help with that. And slowing down your eating periods, like making sure that you are chewing your food more, things like that just really help. But yeah, I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are on this. Let me know if you liked this style of episode where I've reviewed like an academic paper. I really enjoyed doing this. I really enjoyed reading it. So yeah, let me know what your thoughts are. But otherwise, hopefully you have enjoyed this episode, and I will catch you in the next one.